There is a brutal difference between knowing a technique and understanding the mechanism behind it. And in the case of visualization, that difference separates the people who transform their reality from the people who spend years practicing without seeing any change, convinced the problem lies within themselves, when in reality, the problem lies in what was never explained. Itzhak Bentov did not arrive at his conclusions through spiritual intuition. He arrived through measurements, experiments, and a rare ability to see connections between worlds that most people treat as opposites, the physics of the universe and the physics of human consciousness. And what he found at that intersection was disturbing enough to completely change the way any reasonably serious person should look at their own mind and at the practice of visualization. Bentov mapped, with technical precision, the exact brain state in which the human mind stops resisting and begins to obey. That specific physiological condition, without which no visualization reaches enough depth to reprogram absolutely anything. He identified why emotion is the only element that transforms a mental image into a real command, and how the electromagnetic field of the human body synchronizes with the surrounding environment in ways that data confirms and that skepticism cannot dismiss. If you have ever felt like you are doing everything right and nothing changes, what this man discovered will explain exactly why. And more than that, it will show you how to practice visualization the way he spent his entire life teaching. In 1979, the scientific world was still debating whether the human mind could, in some way, interfere with physical reality. Conferences, papers, theories, everything revolved around a question that seemed to have no answer. And while all of that was happening, one man had already arrived at the exact mechanism of how that process works. He did not get there through faith, did not get there through spiritual doctrines, and he definitely did not get there sitting in meditation circles with incense burning. Incense burning. This man was an engineer, an inventor, a researcher, someone who looked at the cosmos with the cold precision of someone who measures, calculates, and proves. His name was Itzhak Bentov. And what he discovered about visualization, a practice that millions of people were already performing at that time and continue performing today, was so disturbing, so contrary to what everyone believed, that to this day, most people attempting to use this technique have no idea they are doing exactly the opposite of what they should. They are not merely wasting time. They are, in practice, reinforcing and solidifying the very things they most want to change in their lives. Bentov spent years studying the relationship between states of human consciousness and quantum physics, diving into territories that conventional science simply did not have the courage to explore. He did not separate the inner experience from outer reality. On the contrary, he treated both as faces of the same integrated system, where what happens inside the human being is not parallel to what happens in the world, but directly connected to it through measurable physical laws. That vision was not poetic. It was technical. And it was that technical mindset that led him to identify something no guru, no coach, and no self-help book had ever described with that level of precision. Visualization, as most people practice it, rests on a silent and completely mistaken assumption that simply creating a clear mental image of what one desires is enough for the subconscious to start working in that direction. People close their eyes, project scenes of success, wealth, health, relationships, and they wait. They wait days, they wait months, and nothing changes. The immediate conclusion is that the technique does not work, or that they simply do not have the gift for it. But Bentov pointed to a third possibility, far more uncomfortable. The technique works perfectly, just in the wrong direction, because what the subconscious registers is not the image you project, but the emotional and neurological state from which you project that image. And that detail changes absolutely everything. What Bentov discovered, and what you will understand in depth in the coming parts of this content, is not a new technique. It is a new understanding of how the human nervous system and the energy field of the universe communicate. An understanding that, once fully absorbed, makes it impossible to practice visualization the old way without seeing the mistake. Bentov spent years mapping what happens inside the human brain during deep states of meditation and visualization, and what he found was not abstract. It was measurable, reproducible, and above all, explainable through physics. He identified that the brain in certain states enters a process he described as resonance between the microcosm and the macrocosm. In plain language, the human nervous system begins to oscillate in synchrony with energy patterns, far greater than the body itself. Greater than the body itself. The electromagnetic field of the heart, the brain waves, the breath, everything begins to pulse in coherence, like instruments in an orchestra, finally playing at the same frequency. But here is the point that completely transforms the way this practice should be understood. That resonance does not happen through the force of imagination. It does not happen because someone desires something intensely, or because someone repeats affirmations with conviction. It happens when visualization stops being a mental exercise and becomes a bodily experience. Bentov was direct about this. Most people visualize the way someone watches a movie, sitting in a theater seat, observing the scene from the outside, as a spectator of the very life they wish to build. And it is precisely that detachment that sabotages the entire process before it even begins. The human subconscious does not process symbols the same way the conscious mind does. It does not read intentions, does not interpret desires, and does not respond to intellectual effort. What it registers as real is what the nervous system experiences as true. And that distinction is devastating for anyone who still believes that visualizing is merely an exercise in mental concentration. When the body does not feel the scene, when there is no genuine physiological response during visualization, heartbeat, a sense of presence, authentic emotional activation, the subconscious simply receives no command. The image passes and disappears, leaving no trace in the deeper layers of the mind. A case of return. Bentov compared this process to the functioning of any physical communication system. For a signal to be transmitted and received clearly, the sender and the receiver must operate on the same frequency. When you visualize in the wrong state, tense, scattered, intellectually forced, it is like trying to transmit a high-precision message through a channel filled with static noise. The signal exists, the intention exists, but the message does not arrive. And what does arrive most of the time is exactly the emotional state you carry throughout the practice. The anxiety of wanting, the insecurity of not having, the veiled doubt that maybe it will not work. And the subconscious, faithful to what it receives, begins to organize the surrounding reality around that state. What Bentov was pointing to, with all the precision of an engineer who measures before he concludes, was that effective visualization requires a prior condition that almost no one prepares, a specific state of the nervous system, a particular brain frequency, without which no mental image has enough depth to reach where it needs to go. In his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, Bentov described something that most readers passed over without registering the weight of what was written. He mapped human consciousness not as a single fixed state, but as a system that expands in layers, each vibrating at a specific frequency, each with a distinct level of permeability to what comes from outside and what comes from within. And what he discovered while studying those layers radically changed the understanding of why certain experiences leave permanent marks on the human psyche, while others simply evaporate without a trace. The logic is straightforward. A mental image generated in the wrong state of consciousness does not penetrate the deeper layers of the subconscious. It exists on the surface, circulates at the level of conscious thought, and dissolves without creating any real modification in the person's internal structure. Bentov used a physical analogy to explain this. It was like trying to record a signal onto a receiver that is tuned to a different frequency. The signal is sent, the effort is real, but the recording never happens because the channel is not open. And the person keeps practicing day after day without understanding why nothing changes, because from their perspective, they are doing everything right. The right frequency, according to Bentov, is the hypnagogic state. That particular zone between sleep and wakefulness, that suspended moment most people pass through quickly without awareness in the transition to sleep or upon waking, is where theta brain waves dominate the nervous system. EBS. And it is in that state that the barrier between the conscious and the subconscious practically disappears, not weakens, not thins, disappears. What enters in that state goes in deep without filters, without resistance, without the critical scrutiny that the waking brain applies to everything it receives. Bentov was not describing something mystical or inaccessible. He was pointing to a state that every human being experiences naturally every single day, only without any control over it, without any directed intention, and therefore without any real use of the potential that state carries. The question was not about accessing something extraordinary. It was about learning to remain conscious in a state the body already knows, but which the waking mind normally abandons before realizing where it was. What makes this discovery even more impactful is what it reveals about all visualization practices carried out outside that state. They are not neutral practices. A visualization performed with tension, with haste, with the brain in beta waves, the state of alertness and conscious processing, not only fails to reprogram the subconscious, it reinforces the current pattern because the subconscious registers the dominant emotional state during the practice. And in most cases, that state is precisely one of lack, anxiety, and waiting for something that has not yet arrived. And it was precisely by deepening this layer of the problem that Bentov arrived at the most devastating mistake of all, one that lies not in the method, but in the emotion the method carries within itself. Bentov did not stop at the diagnosis. He went further, and with the same precision he used to measure frequencies and map states of consciousness, he identified the error at the root of every visualization that fails. Not the wrong state, not the wrong time, but the wrong emotion. And when he says wrong emotion, he is not talking about pessimism or lack of faith. He is talking about something far more subtle and far more common, the emotion of absence disguised as desire. Through experiments with biofeedback and brainwave measurements, Bentov demonstrated that emotion is not an accompaniment to visualization. It is the fuel that transforms a mental image into a real command for the subconscious. Without authentic emotion, the image is nothing more than a drawing. With the wrong emotion, the image becomes a reinforcement of the very state the person most wants to leave behind. Because the subconscious does not read the content of the scene being visualized, it reads the emotional state of the body doing the visualizing. And if that state carries, even subtly, the feeling that what is desired has not yet arrived, that it is lacking, that it is distant, that it is something being waited for rather than something being lived, that is exactly the frequency it registers and begins to sustain in the outer reality. What Bentov demanded of correct visualization was something that runs completely against the natural instinct of anyone who desires change. Not to see the future seen as something that is yet to happen, but to feel in the body, right now, the weight of the accomplishment already achieved, the warmth of the fulfillment already completed, the physical and emotional texture of a reality that for the nervous system already exists. Even if the outer world does not yet reflect it, not as a performance, not as a mechanical repetition of forced feelings, but as a genuinely felt experience where the body responds as if it were real. Because to the subconscious, everything felt with enough intensity is real. This point was categorical for Bentov. The human subconscious does not possess the ability to distinguish between an experience lived with total intensity and an experience visualized with total intensity. That is not a motivational claim. It is a conclusion that emerges directly from the study of the nervous system, from the way the brain processes memory, emotion, and reality. Neuroscience experiments that came decades after Bentov confirmed exactly this. The brain activates the same neural circuits during an intense real experience and during a vivid, emotionally charged visualization. The difference between the two, from the subconscious's point of view, is practically non-existent. And it was on that foundation that Bentov began to build the most surprising part of all his research. The part that went beyond the mind, beyond the subconscious, and reached the relationship between the human body's electromagnetic field and the physical structure of the surrounding environment. What Bentov described next was the point at which many scientists of that era simply stopped following. Not because he had lost his rigor, but because the conclusion was too large to fit within the boundaries of what conventional science was willing to accept. He stated with data, with measurements, and with the technical language of someone who had spent years studying physics, that the human body functions as a biological oscillator, a system that, just like any physical oscillator, has the capacity to enter into synchrony with other systems around it when operating at the correct frequency. This is not symbolic language. Bentov was describing a real physical phenomenon, the same principle that causes two pendulums on the same surface to eventually synchronize, the same principle behind the resonance between musical instruments, applied to the electromagnetic field generated by the human heart and brain in states of deep coherence. And what he discovered was that a person who enters genuine coherence through correct visualization, in the hypnagogic state, with complete sensory immersion, with authentic emotion, begins to emit an electromagnetic field that synchronizes with energy patterns in the surrounding environment. The internal field stops being merely internal. It expands, and the environment music begins to respond to it. Bentov measured this, calculated it, documented it, and the results pointed to something that skepticism could not simply dismiss with the word coincidence. People who practiced visualization with total sensory and emotional immersion did not merely transform their internal states, they objectively altered the way the surrounding environment responded to them. Opportunities arose where, before there had been no opening at all. Connections formed with people and circumstances that seemed to appear from nowhere. Decisions that had been stalled began to move. Reality, as Bentov described it, with a precision that remains difficult to refute even today, began to reorganize itself in the direction of the internal frequency. The person was sustaining. What he was describing was not magic. It was the natural behavior of a physical system responding to a frequency change in another system with which it is in contact. The difference is that the system in question is the human being, and the environment with which it enters into resonance is the totality of the energy field around it. People, situations, probabilities, events. Everything that appears external and independent begins to respond to the internal state when that state reaches enough coherence to radiate beyond the boundaries of the body. And it was upon reaching that point that Bentov consolidated what would become the most explosive legacy of all his research. Not as a spiritual promise, not as a philosophical vision, but as a technical instruction about what visualization truly is and what it is capable of doing, when practiced in the way he spent his entire life describing. The legacy of Itzhak Bentov is not stored in temples, does not circulate in esoteric communities, and does not depend on any belief system to function. It is written, documented, calculated, available to anyone willing to take seriously what a meticulous engineer spent decades proving. And the central instruction he left behind, the one that very few people have truly absorbed, is direct and to the point. Visualization is not a technique for optimism. It is not an exercise in positive thinking. It is not a sophisticated way of feeling good about yourself for a few minutes before falling asleep. It is a technology for reprogramming consciousness. And like every technology, it works according to the principles that govern it, regardless of who uses it and what that person believes. Bentov died in 1979 in a plane crash before seeing much of modern neuroscience confirm what he had mapped with the limited instruments available to him at the time. But the map he left behind about the states of consciousness, about the who ends as a deep subconscious, about the role of emotion as the fuel of reprogramming, about the electromagnetic coherence between the body and the environment remains to this day one of the most precise and complete ever drawn by a human being who refused to separate science from consciousness. Practicing visualization, the way Bentov described, demands a shift that goes far beyond technique. It demands abandoning the posture of someone who desires and does not yet have, and internally building the posture of someone who already lives what they desire, not as self-deception, not as a denial of current reality, but as a deliberate and conscious reprogramming of the emotional and neurological state from which the person operates. Because it is that state, and not external circumstances, that determines the frequency field the body emits. And it is that field that the surrounding environment reads, responds to, and begins to reorganize. The question Bentov left implicit throughout his entire body of work was not, does this work? He had already answered that question with data. The real question was different, and it is personal, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore after understanding everything he discovered. If visualization practiced the wrong way reinforces exactly what you do not want, and if you keep practicing it the wrong way, what does that say about the internal state you are sustaining every single day? Not during visualization, but throughout your entire life. That question has no easy answer, but it has an answer. And Bentov spent his entire life pointing toward it, not with words of comfort, but with the cold and liberating precision of someone who understands that human consciousness, when operated correctly, does not ask permission for reality to change. It simply instructs the field around it to reorganize, and the field obeys. Before closing out this video, one honest question is worth sitting with. What frequency have you been sustaining every day? Not during visualization, but throughout your entire life. Because that is exactly what the field around you is reading right now. If this content shifted something in the way you see your own mind, comment below what hit you the hardest. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next video.